So what are the characteristics of this stage and the lessons that we want to learn from it? So number one, the dating phase is usually the time where you meet somebody, you experience attraction, maybe even romantic feelings, and this phase usually lasts from about 0 to 6 months. And this is the phase where we start learning about somebody. We start understanding some of their initial qualities, trying to decide if we feel that this is a fit for us to commit more time and energy to, trying to connect with this person, sort of analyzing where this goes. And this is a lot about sort of impressing another person and sort of being on our best behavior, and the mind naturally does this. Now, where this goes wrong for the anxious, preoccupied individual is if our dating phase is more about codependently trying to earn our worth from this person than it is about seeing this person, showing up as ourselves, and trying to understand if we think that this is a fit and if it's worthy for us to commit our time and energy to this person. And what I often see as a common pattern for the anxious, preoccupied individual is that when they go into dating somebody, they're not sitting there trying to decide, hey, is this person a good fit for my life? Do they make me feel good? Do we connect well together? Do we have similar interests and values and desires for a future? Instead of looking at it from sort of this evaluation point of view, often, and I've heard this from many, many anxious, preoccupied people, is I will hear them say things like, no, when I'm dating, it's actually usually me trying to impress the person and hope that they love me and don't leave me. And so sometimes the anxious, preoccupied, especially if there's more anxious, preoccupied traits in this individual, they're more intense on the spectrum. Often what I can see is that this person misses out on the logical assessment of trying to decide how this person makes them feel and how they feel around this person, and if they can see this person as being beneficial for their lives, because they are often so preoccupied with trying to make sure that they don't get abandoned and trying to impress the person and earn their worth. And so sometimes they dismiss themselves in the equation as they're going through the dating phase. So this phase is lessons, okay, for all people, and then how they specifically apply to the anxious, preoccupied. The first lesson is clarity. Getting really clear. What do I want in a relationship? And I suggest journaling this, writing this down, okay? And even if you're in a phase now where let's say you're in a relationship for 4 years right now and you are feeling stuck in the power struggle phase, if you haven't learned all the lessons from the earlier phases, it's going to impact your ability to move through the phase that you're currently in. So do all of this work from all stages, even if you know that you're further ahead, you're not dating the person you're with right now. Make sure that you sort of crossed all your T's and dotted all your I's as you go through each of these stages, because otherwise they will show up as an obstacle to progressing through the natural life cycle of a relationship in these future stages. So number one, journal out, okay? Clarity. What do I want in a relationship? What qualities and traits are important to me? Does this person fit these qualities? Okay. Now, if you're single, you just skip that part of the question. Just who do I think would fit these qualities, or what do I want in a relationship? What qualities and traits are important to me? And then if you're in a relationship, how does this person make me feel when I'm around them? Now, be careful when you're writing these things out. This is another sort of drawback on the other side that I see anxious, preoccupied individuals going through sometimes anxious, preoccupied individuals can have these very extreme expectations as well that can actually block you. So if you are sitting there going, here's what I want in a relationship, and these are all the traits, but then when somebody comes along, if they're missing one or two of the traits, you're like, oh, this isn't the person. The anxious individual is less likely to go, oh, this isn't the person, but they are still highly likely to judge the person and be like, they're not doing this, and sometimes have these unrealistic expectations instead of just recognizing, hey, this person doesn't meet exactly this need, and bringing it into conversation to ask for this need to be met, or to express and create this collaborative possibility for this need to be met between the two parties. So be careful of that at the same time. So lesson one, clarity. Lesson two, personal empowerment, okay? A great set of questions to ask yourself, and not from a preoccupied space, but just from an honest space of taking inventory in your traits, are what do I need to become to bring this quality of person into my life? So if this is your current partner, and there's some unmet needs or some traits that you don't see, what do you need to become in order to bring this set of qualities or traits into your life? So for example, maybe your partner doesn't respect your boundaries. So maybe you need to become the person who speaks up about their boundaries more and sees their needs through more consistently. Maybe you are single and you're going, okay, who do I need to become to attract the right person into my life as a whole? Maybe you shy away from connecting or being vulnerable, and so you're not getting, the opportunity to properly meet people that could be a fit for you. So just assess, take some time to really take inventory in this area. What do I need to become to attract the right person for me or the right qualities into my relationship now? Where am I not empowered in any area of my life that prevents me from creating progress in my relationship? And what fears, wounds, or beliefs do I need to overcome for this stage to be enjoyable? Sometimes I see on this lesson of personal empowerment that individuals will shy away from dating altogether because they have these really painful beliefs that it will never work out, or I'll be abandoned eventually anyways, or different sort of aspects like that. And so these can be major fears or wounds that prevent an individual from progressing in the personal empowerment stage. I also want you to know that in this stage and the honeymoon phase of a relationship, if you are not actively empowering yourself in each of the 7 areas of life, usually your relationship will end up highlighting where you are already disempowered when it comes to the power struggle stage. So for example, if you are not feeling empowered in your self-esteem, often what you'll start to see in the power struggle stage is that starts to get emphasized, and for some reason, directly or indirectly, you will come to feel like your relationship is making your self-esteem worse, when really it just tends to magnify the patterns that are already existing within us, so that we can step up and empower those aspects of ourselves. So it's a really important lesson to learn in the early parts of dating is, where am I empowered and where do I need to create more empowerment so that I feel really good about myself as I start the initial life cycle of a relationship? What do I need to essentially nurture and fertilize a little bit more as I'm beginning this journey? Stage number 3 has a lot to do with self-awareness. What judgments do you make about this person in the dating phase? What fears come up for you in this dating phase? What do I ruminate about? And what does this say about my core wounds or unmet needs? An example here is I often see the anxious, preoccupied individual go through a lot of rumination about what did they do wrong or right on a date, and replaying the date and hyper analyzing the date and sort of trying to fit themselves into what they should be on a date. And there can be a lot of exhaustion here and a lot of self-abandonment because you are so concerned about seeing yourself through this person's imagined set of values and what you think they would want from you. And it can be really a deep self-betrayal if you're just trying to contort yourself into this box of what you think this person wants from you. So it's an important thing to be aware of in the dating phase of a relationship. Boundaries, and is lesson number 4. Do I abandon myself in this relationship? Am I starting to date and am I keeping up with healthy habits, or do I discard my plans and needs in order to try to be available for this person whenever they're available? Very common amongst anxious preoccupieds. Do I lose myself in this phase early on? Okay, so just take inventory there. Now, when we go into the patterns of this stage, you want to start becoming conscious of some of these patterns that can show up and create a strategy. So a couple of the patterns I often see for the anxious preoccupied in the dating phase of a relationship is, like I was mentioning earlier, they can become sort of codependently focused on impressing or earning their worthiness or acceptance from the person they're dating. And this is obviously common for the anxious preoccupied because of the fear of abandonment, which can basically be overpowering and make the anxious preoccupied go on autopilot. So take note and recognize that we often turn on our autopilot coping mechanisms in the areas related to past traumas. So let's say, for example, if you interpreted in your childhood that you had to earn love or control situations in order to prevent abandonment, it's almost like you get hypnotized in your external environment when you go into a dating situation. Usually this pattern comes back up again for you if you haven't worked through it, and this coping mechanism becomes active. So you can go back into this almost like childlike version of yourself, trying to earn your worth and control situations and control this person's perceptions of you. And it can be exhausting and, again, self-betraying. So instead of, entering into dates and trying to be that person, try to practice calmly entering into dates and connecting to try to decide if a person is right for you, because you can lose yourself in trying to win approval and even lose out on your ability to gain clarity and make constructive decisions related to dating. And you know, we are who we surround ourselves with. People in our dating lives have a tremendous impact on our personality over time and in our lifestyle and life decisions. So it's very important that we get clear about ourselves in this area. So another pattern I often see for the anxious attachment individual in this phase is that the fear of abandonment can be triggered sort of as a whole. And often this exemplifies itself as the anxious preoccupied individual ruminating over texts, having a really difficult time waiting, wondering when this person's going to text them back, becoming really preoccupied and almost a little bit obsessive at times about how often this person's communicating with them, what's going on if they're not communicating that often, and a lot of sort of pain points coming up in this area. Now, this might seem like it's just this small stressful thing on a surface level, but it really creates a lot of patterns to be out of a harmonious relationship within yourself, because you're so focused on somebody else that you're sort of disowning and almost like completely disconnected, even a little bit dissociated from your own feelings, your own needs, where you're at, what you need to be in a healthy, balanced state in all 7 areas of your own life. And on top of that, it creates this context of subordination to our partner, which often also creates breeding grounds for resentment long term. So we want to feel like we're sort of in this equal playing field, and this also prepares us for the power struggle phase in the future, where we can practice shared power between 2 individuals. And sometimes as well, our expectations about text and how often to communicate or phone calls can be a lot different than our partners at this stage. So sometimes we have very high expectations of how much time and conversation should be had through text and phone in the dating phase, and we can obsess in this area. And people pleasing is another really challenging situation here. Like, I often see anxious, preoccupied individuals dropping their plans. Like, let's say they're interested in somebody and they have plans on a Friday night, and then, Friday morning, this person says, "Oh, are you free tonight?" And it's sort of this last minute question. Sometimes what I'll see is the anxious person drops and cancels their own plans and essentially disempowers areas of their own life to try to meet with the person of interest that they're dating. And this again sets the tone for a toxic relationship long term. Okay, some other patterns I see in this stage are preoccupation with what this person thinks of you, always trying to decide, are they thinking this? Are they thinking that? And it can bring us into the cognitive distortion of mind reading. I also often see this individual over analyzing many of their interactions. Okay, perfectionism can come up quite strongly for the anxious preoccupied, and even patterns like seeking evidence that the partner isn't interested any longer. Another common behavior I see in this stage is a lot of what I call chameleoning, like morphing yourself into someone else in order to gain acceptance. So, for example, maybe you can, start shifting your political views or your opinions to try to match them up with this person's and find some common ground. Sometimes anxious, preoccupied people will start to, say that things bother them that don't, or say that things don't bother them that do, and sometimes they'll just change parts of themselves and be essentially a little bit dishonest in order to try to gain acceptance. And again, this isn't something that makes this person some bad person. This is a survival behavior or a coping mechanism that this individual adapted or adopted from childhood during traumatic events. But it is so important to be aware of this, because again, this is very painful and creates a lot of long-term damage in the relationship to yourself. And again, if we're out of a healthy relationship dynamic towards ourselves, that is going to bleed right into our romantic relationships eventually. Okay? Another couple patterns before we move on to the expectations piece here are seeking emotional validation too early, when someone else might be moving at a different pace and taking longer to develop feelings. So something that's very common is that a dismissive avoidant, for example, often spends a lot of time in the dating phase of a relationship. They take a long time to warm up. They take a lot longer to develop deep feelings, whereas the anxious partner sometimes can have a first date and be like, this was the best first date, and develop very strong feelings right out of the gates. And so we want to be able to recognize the difference between feeling attracted to somebody versus actual attraction and romantic feelings. They're all sort of three separate stages that exist within the dating phase. So we can feel physical attraction but not be attracted to a person. Okay, an example of this that's very simple to recognize as an analogy is if you are in a romantic relationship already, and let's say you're very happy and very fulfilled, and let's say you're at an event and you see somebody that you find attractive, you might be like, oh, that's an attractive looking person, but you might not feel feelings of attraction, right? Now attraction can be these feelings that come up in you that are very strong and like, oh, I feel this attraction, this need to go connect to somebody or talk to somebody or get to know them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those are romantic feelings for a person. It's almost like you find the person attractive and you find intrigue and maybe you connect with the person a little bit. Now, romantic feelings are their own separate entity. That's when you've gotten to know somebody, you understand them, maybe they are starting to meet needs for you, there's a connection, there's some depth, and then you can start to develop romantic feelings. And I see out of all attachment styles that the anxious preoccupied struggles the most to separate these three pieces out. Often they can find that feeling attracted for them seems to equate to feelings, and all these parts get enmeshed quite quickly and easily. So it's very important in this stage to identify, like, from a logical perspective, where you're truly at, because sometimes the subconscious mind can be so concerned with filling the void of perceived or feared abandonment from childhood that the brain is so busy trying to equilibrate and fill that void that it can get stuck essentially in going from attraction or attractiveness to feelings a little bit too quickly in a way that's not truly giving the anxious person an opportunity to see where they're really at and think about a potential match from a logical place. The last three patterns that I see quite often in this stage that we'll get into in terms of strategies and tips at the end are creating stories, so making a lot of assumptions essentially, filling in the blanks, like, oh, the person didn't call when they said they would, and it must mean that they don't like me at all, or it must mean, this, that, or the other. Putting this person on a pedestal and idealizing this person very significantly. And what can take place here is, like, sometimes that worshiping can also create this third pattern of ignoring negative behaviors and hyper focusing on positive behavior. So sometimes the anxious preoccupied individual can get a little bit too focused on the good and sort of turn too much of a blind eye to the things that might be red flags. So it's very important, if you're the anxious preoccupied, as you're in this stage, to get really clear about this and to ask yourself, what you see really showing up, so that you can take action towards addressing this from a place essentially where your head and heart meet in the middle. So the next part of this module, I'm going to go through the different expectations, the protest behaviors, and some tips and tools. So exercise number 2, the dating phase. Okay, so this is all about journaling and brainstorming. And the purpose of this exercise is to make the subconscious contents of your mind conscious so you can get a clear picture of where you are and what you need to be working on. Okay, now this specifically for anxious preoccupied is a very important exercise to do. And the reason for this is that anxious preoccupied individuals often spend a lot of time in the dating phase of their relationships people pleasing. And that's always going to be a recipe to be let down at some point if you start off on that foot in that phase of a relationship. We can be on our best behavior in a way, or we can try to be really connecting and present, and we can be on, be present and focused and want the date to go well and, be the best version of ourselves. But there's a difference between that and people pleasing, right? People pleasing is like denying your needs, denying your feelings, not speaking up about your opinions, not sharing what's important to you, not sharing what things bother you or upset you if they do, not speaking up about, what you want to eat for dinner, where you want to go on a date, not doing that. And all of those things are layer upon layer of you denying yourself. And all that can possibly happen when you're people pleasing in the dating phase of a relationship is somebody's going to, if they fall in love with you, fall in love with not you. fall in love with this version of yourself that you've constructed, and all you're doing is you're making the power struggle phase of a relationship much more difficult when we reach that point. And so that's, we prepare ourselves for that by being as authentic as possible, as early as possible into dating, so that if we get into a relationship, the person is really seeing us and not this people pleasing version of us. That then when we get to the power struggle phase and we're sick of people pleasing and we start having all these other needs, or we start showing more of ourselves, that the person's not like, whoa, who is this? Where is this person coming from? So you want to get clear. And this whole exercise is for you to get clear. What do you want in a relationship? What traits and qualities are important to you? Does this person you're dating fit those? How does this person make you feel when you're around them? And I ask that question for a very specific reason. Often people will get very involved in people pleasing, who are anxious, preoccupied. So much so that it might be a subconscious comfort zone that they try to get a parent's attention growing up or something like this. And it feels like that's what love is. But when we really look in our adult lives, I actually don't feel good around this person. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells all the time. And we have to really get clear, is this person lifting us? Do we feel good? Do we have a good time? Do we feel safe? Do we feel connected? And so we have to have that checkpoint as an anxious preoccupied, okay? And then in terms of personal empowerment, you can ask yourself, what do I need to become to be a match to those qualities that I desire? What patterns do I need to change? And it's going to be very easy for an anxious preoccupied person to go into the mindset, I have to people please more. No, you are probably looking as the anxious preoccupied person. Where do I need to express my needs more? Set boundaries more so that I can have a healthy dynamic and exchange. Speak up for myself more, evaluate somebody a little bit more thoroughly, check in with myself more often. These are going to be the things that you need to work on here. And that's why we say, what fears, wounds, or beliefs do I need to overcome for this stage to be more enjoyable? Okay, if there's anything outstanding there. And then we go through self-awareness and boundaries, checkpoints in terms of those questions. What judgments do I make about this person? What fears come up? For me, is there anything I'm ruminating about? And again, this is like a very big discovery portion of the workbook here to help you get clear on some of your patterns that do emerge during the dating phase, so you can clean them up and do the reprogramming work as quickly as possible. And the very last piece in here is the boundaries. Do you keep up with your healthy habits? Are you discarding other areas of your life? Part of being secure when you're coming from an anxious space is going to be, do I balance all 7 areas of my life? Or do I date somebody and throw everybody out the window? Start going into work late, start spending all my money on dates, start paying for expensive vacations when the other person's not contributing, stop spending time with my friends and family. Do I find that all these things that are meaningful to me I throw out the window? And if you are doing that, that is a direct symptom of you giving up yourself. You are throwing out your sense of self. All of these different places and important areas of life that we have 7 of them. They're all very important. We want balance and harmony across all boards. And if we're throwing out our sense of self, then that is a symptom of us becoming very codependent. We're on track to have a really painful and challenging power struggle phase of a relationship. We're also on track for somebody to mirror those behaviors back to us at a subconscious level, and so also make us feel like we're thrown away or we're being discarded. And there's different reasons for that, but I want you guys to be clear on all these different dynamics, why they're so important to navigate and break through and do the work on. So some of the expectations in this phase for the anxious preoccupied attachment style versus the expectations that are often coming from others, and even just some of healthier expectations overall, I'm going to go through in this module. So first and foremost, there are often expectations from the anxious preoccupied that the person that you're dating moves as quickly as you from attracted to feelings. So attracted, attraction, feelings. And your feelings can sometimes be magnified by your attachment style being activated. So sometimes as well, for the anxious preoccupied, You might go on 2 or 3 dates and be like, "Ooh, I'm feeling a lot of attraction to this person." And then if you see them pull away, because these core wounds and triggers from childhood, like fear of abandonment, fear of being alone, fear of being rejected or not good enough, because some of these things can pop up inside of you, it's as a result of these wounds being activated that what can be taking place is that you start thinking, "Oh my gosh, I have all these feelings," because you're feeling so many emotions relative to the relationship and the circumstance. When really it could be that you're just still in the attraction phase, but these wounds are triggered and they don't make you feel good, and they're actually your wounds and internal feelings to work on. But if you are perceiving them as being from the person outside of you, you might confuse your feelings with your emotions because of triggers. So that's a really important thing to just recognize and take inventory of. And also, sometimes I'll see the anxious preoccupied being, sort of moving through the attraction and feeling phases quite quickly and strongly. And then there's this feeling of rejection if the other person isn't moving at the same pace. And so instead of the anxious preoccupied perceiving something like, "Oh, maybe this person has a different attachment style, or maybe they take slower to develop feelings, maybe they have more walls up and they're slower to warm up," instead they might be like, "Oh, they're not as interested in me as I am in them and I'm going to lose them." And they start looking for reasons that the relationship won't work, or that they're going to be abandoned, because their psyche starts going into sort of survival mode and fear-based thinking mode. And so that's really important to recognize so that you don't fall into that trap. Okay, so a great thing to ask yourself is, am I feeling this way about the person, or about my story of the person and the ideals I've projected onto this person? So something we see often for the anxious preoccupied as well is that as they start dating, they can start getting very idealistic, which has its benefits too. But they can start getting really into the storytelling and like the thoughts about the future and why this person would be a good wife or a good husband, or and get really into like future planning and emotional hungering for a deeper bond. And they can confuse their story of a person with the person themselves, because again, they can sort of come from that space where they're hyper focusing on the positive traits and not really looking at the negative, or even sometimes going, "Yeah, they're this way now, which means they're gonna be this way in the future. So, oh yeah, they're quite polite now, so they're going to be so polite when they meet my parents, and my parents are just going to love this person, and they're going to connect so well." And so you can start sort of like filling in the blanks too much and making assumptions about this individual right now and the little bit of information I have about them and what that means for the future. Now, there's parts of this that are romantic and sweet because it creates that infatuation and those neurochemicals and all these different things. However, it does not set you up well for the power struggle phase, because if you have this idealized version of a person that's not a fully accurate depiction of who this person truly is, or that has a whole bunch of expectations sort of stamped onto the person, then when you get in the power struggle phase and the masks sort of come off and people are not on their best behavior any longer, and there's a neurochemical withdrawal from the high of the honeymoon phase and some of the early or some of the latter parts of the dating phase, what can really take place is that this stage can be a lot more painful. So it's really important to get clear about this ahead of time and try to stay grounded in making sure that your feelings are about this person truly as they are, not your story of this person as you see them. Okay. Another really important expectation that's necessary to sort of rectify is the expectations around the frequency and length of communication. So I just want to show you some of the different attachment style components. So often when a dismissive avoidant is starting a relationship, they want to communicate roughly every 3 to 5 days at the beginning. And this isn't for all dismissive avoidance, this isn't the only way that it works, but I would say it's a general pattern that I've seen through hundreds of case studies with dismissive avoidant attachment styles. They like when they're dating to be slower to warm up. And so if they meet somebody, they might go on a date once and then touch base again 3, 4, 5 days later, meet again maybe for another date a week or even 2 weeks later. And this for the anxious preoccupied feels like an eternity and feels like a disinterest and is very activating of the attachment style. So keep in mind, instead of making it mean and filling in the blanks and making assumptions with your core wounds, instead of making it mean like, oh, this person definitely isn't interested, or oh my gosh, the date didn't go well for them, just recognize that different attachment styles and the frequency of how much they see each other, and the frequency of communication, and the length of these things, they tend to vary quite dramatically. Fearful avoidance, depending on who they're with, can be every 2 to 3 days. If they're with a dismissive avoidant, sometimes a little bit more because it triggers the anxious side. And if they're with an anxious preoccupied, it can be a little bit less, right? So be very clear. And then even secure individuals don't necessarily jump out of the gates, meet somebody, and want to communicate to them every single day. I would say that I see that very a lot less than I think what a lot of people are expecting from the anxious preoccupied sector as they enter into a romantic partnership. So keep in mind, talking 2 or 3 times a week in the dating phase, the first 0 to 6 months, doesn't necessarily mean anything bad, okay? And that's just really important to be clear about your expectations here. Now, I also see a bit of a struggle with the expectations of a person sort of as a whole. And this can be the result of overly idealizing somebody, and so then when they don't fit into your story of them, you experience a form of rejection. So they might think, for example, like, oh my gosh, this person, like we spent so much time together on our first date. They value spending as much time together as I do. And then let's say you leave the date, and the next time you're on a second date, they leave after 3 hours instead of 8 hours. Because you've created this expectation in your mind, when the person doesn't match that expectation, it's almost like your subconscious mind rejects itself based on the story it's created. And so you want to be really clear about recognizing, like, hold on, what are my expectations of this person, and how they should be behaving, and what traits they should express, and how quickly they should be moving along. And you want to be able to separate your expectations from your needs, okay? If you just expect that this person's going to act in this way and this way and this way, that's very different from saying, hey, you know what, it's important to me to have deep conversation and a lot of connection in a relationship, and being able to show up for that, set a boundary around people who don't give you that, and also express your need for that in a relationship. The expression of a need is healthy. The unconscious expectations that often lead to rejection can be quite unhealthy and quite painful. And the last major expectation I want to touch on are, you expect yourself and every date to be perfect and go incredibly well. And sometimes as a result of this, you can ruminate and feel frustrated by any glitch or imperfection in a relationship or on a date, and do a lot of self-blaming, like, oh, why did I make that joke, or why did I say that thing? And that can be very diminishing to your self-esteem. And having healthy self-esteem is a very important part of having a healthy relationship dynamic. So it's important to clean up any intense self-criticism, self-judgment around being imperfect, and to start accepting and seeing and recognizing some of your flaws and making them okay as you move through this dating cycle. Now, the protest behaviors and the underlying fears that I see in this stage. So I'm going to just put them into 5 main categories, and then I'm going to give you some solutions and tips here. So the categories that I often see for the anxious preoccupied that these fall under in terms of protest behaviors are contact protest behaviors, attention-seeking protest behaviors, manipulative protest behaviors, hostile protest behaviors, and control-based protest behaviors, okay? So I'm just going to give you some examples of each one and just take inventory as I go through this, and cite or write in your workbook where any of these things come up for you. So contact behaviors. So sometimes we'll see that the anxious partner, when their expectations are triggered and sort of let down for how often to communicate, sometimes I'll see that the anxious partner can do things like double or triple texting really early in a relationship, like somebody doesn't answer them in said period of time, maybe an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, and they'll send some question marks to their question, or they'll send another follow-up text, or things like this. And it's really important to recognize that this often pushes a person away. And this doesn't always, and sometimes secure people, do well with this and all these different things. But remember, people have different lifestyles. Sometimes people are very busy. Sometimes people are, just not big phone people, don't love texting, prefer to communicate through conversation or face to face. Or sometimes people just are more slow moving with their feelings and don't like to commit to so much discussion and conversation right away. And this is, in a way, a really beautiful feature of the anxious preoccupied, that they have such a deep need for connection and are so available and loving and open and warm and willing to like put in the energy to a relationship. But for individuals who are moving at a different pace, sometimes this can feel overwhelming or pressuring, or it can trigger different wounds in different people. So sometimes even the overly long texts or excessive calling, if you don't hear back according to the expectations, these can all be forms of protest behaviors, essentially meaning the behaviors that we take part in when we're feeling negative emotion, and how we are essentially responding through behavior to our own emotional reactions. So that's really important to be aware of. I'll give you some tips and tools in just a moment. The attention-seeking behaviors. So sometimes we'll see the anxious preoccupied trying to make their partner jealous or their friend or family member jealous. Moving towards sexual activity before they're intrinsically ready or comfortable. This is something I see that's fairly common for anxious preoccupied, is sometimes they will feel like there's a disconnect in the relationship. And as they experience this disconnect in the relationship, like let's say, Sally's been on 3 dates with Bob and things seem to be going well, but Bob is just taking his time and Sally's expectations are growing with each date. But maybe Bob isn't, maybe he's more avoidant, and his behavioral change and ability to warm up is not moving at the same pace as Sally's expectations are. And so as a result, Sally might start feeling rejected because of her perception of the situation. And then she might, disrespect her own boundaries and solicit like sexual activity or sex before she's even checked in to see, like, is this what I want? Am I fully ready? Because often anxious, preoccupied individuals, and not always, but often, they can use sex as a strategy for connection when they feel like other things aren't working. So it's really important to check there in terms of attention seeking behaviors. Sometimes they will over sexualize things in general, bring up sex a lot, talk a lot about it. And again, these are not like bad things. Like, everybody is welcome to discuss and do whatever they want that is true and authentic to them. And maybe that's really important to you as your sexual expression. And if so, that's absolutely beautiful. It's not about that, it's about why you're doing it. So just check in there and make sure that you're really clear that these things are truly authentic and congruent for you. Sometimes too, you can become someone you aren't to try to fit into your story about their expectations of you, which can be another example of you violating your own boundaries in terms of these attention-seeking behaviors. So maybe you think that Bob really wants a woman who dresses a certain way or speaks a certain way, or tells other people off if they're bothering her, whatever it is. And so you recognize this in Bob, or you think that you do, and you're like, okay, I'm going to become this way and sort of please Bob. And this can be an indirect boundary violation to yourself if it feels inauthentic, and if it's something that's not true for you, not serving you, but just serving as a tool to try to manifest or create connection between you and another person. Protest behaviors of manipulation, or manipulative protest behaviors. Now, as I say this, I don't want you to look at manipulation as like this evil, horrid thing. Like, all insecure attachment styles have their own versions of how they can show up, or how they have a potential to be manipulative at times. And even secure people can be manipulative at times. Think of manipulation as a subconscious strategy, not just specific to AAs, that humans use when they don't feel safe or know how to communicate or express their needs in a healthy manner. So if you're taught, for example, as a child that you can't express your needs, and you learn that you get punished or criticized when you do, so you feel like, okay, it's not safe to express my needs at all as a whole, your brain, because it's a needs meeting machine, is going to find an indirect way of getting your needs met. And if plan A, B, C, D aren't working, you might go to plan E of becoming manipulative in certain forms to try to get those needs met. So there can be a variety of different patterns that this can take place for the anxious preoccupied, but it can be things like, playing games, watching videos that tell you how to seduce the person or how to make them want you, or all these different things. And I'm not going to say that those are like bad things, or don't do research, or don't learn about like dating and the psyche, because sometimes resources and knowledge can be quite powerful. But I just want to say that sometimes if you get too far down that rabbit hole of trying to like manipulate the situation or the person, number one, you set yourself up for a lot of disaster in the power struggle phase, quite honestly. Number two, you might be showing up as an inauthentic version of yourself, which can then cause a lot more challenges later on. And number three, sometimes you're not giving yourself a chance to really be seen and heard and understood for who you are and what's important to you. And sometimes you don't communicate your needs because you found all these roundabout ways of trying to manipulate the relationship dynamic. And we have to, as a rite of passage, learn to start expressing our needs in order for a healthy relationship to thrive. So we want to work on our behaviors and be aware about our expectations, and we want to do inner work that creates healthy dynamics in a relationship, but from a space of like self-healing, self-recognition, and overall health in a relationship, not from a space of like trying to manipulate and have more power in the situation, because long term there are negative consequences. And then when we talk about the last two protest behaviors, we have our hostile protest behaviors, and an example of this would be criticism. So sometimes I see the anxious preoccupied criticize also when they become afraid to express themselves authentically. So instead of saying, for example, I'm feeling afraid of losing you, or the relationship, or I feel a bit abandoned when I don't hear from you for a couple days, instead, sometimes the anxious preoccupied might say something like, what's wrong with you that you don't call back? Like, who does that? I don't know anybody else that does that. And so sometimes the criticism, you can think of a criticism as a symptom of an inability to properly communicate and feel safe doing so. And this is something you want to work on internally first. And if you start communicating in a healthy way and the person doesn't respond well, it's probably not the right person that's going to create a healthy relationship dynamic with you. Okay. Sometimes I see too comparison to others. So sometimes another hostile behavior will be a comparison piece. So something like, I don't know anybody else who goes that long without texting, and sometimes comparing the person you're dating to other people. And especially for more avoidant attachment styles who do struggle with some inner defectiveness schemas at times, this can be really triggering and painful. So it's important to become aware of this also. And lastly, we have meanness or contempt. And this can be something like, and this usually really begins more so in the power struggle phase, but we can see this start to air and become a little bit obvious during the latter stages of the dating phase. But things like saying to your partner or the person you're dating, like, oh, that's your excuse, like, that's childish, you're such a child, or cry me a river, like, and sort of being a little bit rude or mean when it comes to somebody's feelings because you've had some inner turmoil coming through, maybe because your attachment style has been activated, or maybe because this isn't the right person, or for whatever number of reasons, and your subconscious mind is trying to equilibrate. Oh, you cause me pain, I'm going to cause you pain back. And often even spitefulness is a subconscious strategy for emotional connection, because it's like, if I'm in pain and I can cause you pain, now at least you're feeling my pain and we're emotionally connected. So it's really important to just be aware of some of the hostile protest behaviors that can come up. And lastly, are control behaviors. Controlling is what human beings do when they're afraid and uncertain and trying to stop feeling those emotions, when they don't like their own feelings of fear and uncertainty. And so these control behaviors can be things for the anxious preoccupied, like requesting information or details about whereabouts all the time, or sometimes accidentally disrespecting somebody's boundaries, because sort of demanding that they have information, or asking too many personal things before they can tell that a person is trying to set a boundary and doesn't feel ready to communicate yet or share yet about something. And also triangulating sometimes, and this doesn't have to be something extreme or severe, but just sometimes using other people to communicate or convince this person of something. And just recognize, while we all have different behaviors and things that can take place when we're not feeling 100%, we want to be aware of these things that can show up in our attachment style, in ourselves, and we want to start working with them right away. As soon as we recognize them, And the sooner we work through them, the more smoothly and the more, the future stages of the relationship will be, and the more easily and efficiently we'll progress in the stages throughout the life cycle of a relationship. So in the next part of the module, I am going to go through and just give you some strategies and solutions and a little bit of a tip box for these different protest behaviors that can arise in your attachment style in the dating phase of relationships. Page 7, expectation inventory chart. Okay, so the purpose of this essentially overall is to get really clear about what some of the subconscious expectations are that you bring into a relationship and to really evaluate them from a conscious perspective. So what you're trying to do essentially is take a look at, like, what are the patterns I bring in? Are these things healthy? What do I think somebody else's are? Where do I think the person I'm dating is coming from? Or, if you're single and you're reflecting on a past relationship, where do I think that person was coming from? And then to really consciously evaluate and ask yourself, well, what would be some healthy expectations to be carrying into this dynamic instead? Okay, so we're going to take a look, and I'm going to go through with you guys some really important components in here that are anxious, preoccupied patterns so you can see. So time from attraction to feelings. I want you guys to really evaluate what is your personal pattern in terms of how long it often takes you to go from feeling attracted to somebody to all of a sudden having feelings for somebody. And this is really important because it'll highlight, if you find yourself go, oh my gosh, I think I have feelings almost right away, then you are probably, without meaning to, sort of developing feelings for an image of somebody that your subconscious mind is sort of idealizing because it's trying to utilize that dynamic with that person as a strategy to get its needs met. But you have to understand, if you feel attracted to somebody, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on beneath the surface at a subconscious level that you're not registering consciously. What often happens with anxious, preoccupied individuals is then they go, oh, I have feelings. And they confuse often attraction with feelings, or in a very short period of time. That may not be for everybody, but maybe at the end of a first date or second date. And what you want to be consciously aware of is that, part of like real romantic feelings, not limerence, not attraction, not infatuation, but feelings developing require like really knowing the person when we talk about the context of like having feelings. And that means knowing a little bit of their inner world, not knowing all the formed associations that have been activated because of knowing a little bit about some of their surface world, right? Feelings come from vulnerability, sharing, knowing the person's history, knowing some of their dynamics, some of these things that come out of getting to more deeply see and hear and understand a person. And so sometimes anxious, preoccupied will have the feelings that are actually more attraction. They confuse and intertwine the two. And then they want to move very quickly in a relationship. And this becomes really self-defeating and often disappointing when somebody's moving very differently. The more we can be aware of this, and the more we can consciously kind of guide ourselves along this process, because we go, okay, I'm feeling a lot of attraction. That means there's probably a lot of subconscious comfort zone stuff in here, a lot of needs this person's meeting or has the promise of meeting, or a lot of traits that I've repressed that they're expressing. And that trait variety is a very biologically attractive feature. The more you see all of that, then you can kind of regulate it. And you can also go, okay, I shouldn't necessarily expect Bob to move as quickly as I do, because I know that his attachment style is almost the opposite, and where I'm having all these positive associations triggered, the more he develops feelings, he's probably having some competing negative associations crop up. And it can help us to have like a more rooted stance and awareness in terms of what to expect in relationships, how quickly things should move. And then we can use this awareness to then communicate and to ask questions and to open a dynamic and not personalize things and not storytell around things and not get lost in sort of a dynamic as it's moving along. When it comes to contact, that's going to be kind of an offspring of the natural expectations there. Ask yourself, how much do I expect a person to be in contact with me each and every week or each and every day? For anxious, preoccupied, a big subconscious expectation they tend to carry is, oh, we should talk all day, every day. And when I ask a lot of anxious, preoccupied people historically, well, what do you think is healthy? What do you think is like the average or the norm? Or what do you think two secure people would be? Most of the answers I get are, I don't know, maybe touch base like 2 or 3 times a day. not necessarily all day, every day. And that's true. Like touching base a little bit here and there, because what we don't want is we don't want to lose our sense of self to anything. We want to be able to have new things that come into our sense of self and that are a beautiful benefit and create harmonious interrelations in, with our sense of self, but we don't want to lose our sense of self to anything. So by shifting our expectations around how much we want to be in contact with somebody, and even if we have like a compromise where we go, okay, not all day, every day, but maybe twice in the morning, once in the afternoon, and a call in the evening before bed, whatever it might be, then we also don't personalize so much when somebody doesn't text back and forth with us all day. And we don't fall down that rabbit hole of taking every gap in a text back as a rejection, especially when we can get clear about what the other person's programming is like, see them more for who they truly are, instead of something that all humans do, which is a very painful dynamic, is we try to play God. We try to go, everybody should be behaving exactly how I expect them to be behaving at all times, and if they don't, then I start telling a really painful story about myself, or I start getting mad at that person. But it's a really powerful thing to practice checking yourself with that, because when we stop putting expectations on people's behaviors that we don't know, or in dynamics that we have, we're free to actually see people as people. And we save a lot of friggin' wasted time on that game that the subconscious mind likes to play. We get part of that game as a large result of the punishment reward system and how we're all socialized, and that's its own topic of conversation, but it's a powerful thing. And when anxious, preoccupied individuals apply this to contact and how frequently they're communicating with somebody, you free yourself of a lot of like, why isn't she texting me back? Why hasn't he talked to me yet? We want to break out of that, because it doesn't do anything for anyone, especially not ourselves. So we can look at that. We can look at what we think would be healthy. And then when we're waiting or we're worrying, we can remind ourselves, hey, it's okay that it's been 2 hours since I haven't been in contact. It's actually healthy for this to happen. And it doesn't mean anything about how this person feels about me. If anything, it just means that we have different programmed expectations of how often to communicate to begin with. Then this goes into time spent together. We're going to apply those same rules. Commitment in general, how quickly we make a commitment. We're going to check in with ourselves, what we think according to the other person's programming, what they might expect. Knowing this, or asking questions to that person about this, allows us to facilitate healthier conversations. It allows us to be more direct. It allows us to compromise more effectively between our set of programs and another person's. And a really important question in here is our expectations of ourselves. If you're the anxious, preoccupied, how much pressure do I put on myself in a relationship? How much, do I expect myself to people please or be perfect or not show any weakness or vulnerability? Like, where are you putting pressure and expectations? And then, of course, any general expectations of the relationship as a whole. In our tip box here, about how to work through some of the protest behaviors and wounds or challenges that can come up for your attachment style in the dating phase of the relationship. So we're going to go through the rumination, the waiting for text, waiting for communication. We're going to go through the overanalyzing, the perfectionism, the too early syndrome, chameleoning, and pedestaling, okay? And I'm just going to give you a quick tip or strategy for each of these places. So number one, if you find yourself ruminating or waiting and it's really causing distress, one of the first things that you want to do is manage your expectations. Get really clear on what you are expecting from your partner or the person you're dating, and ask yourself, like, are these expectations valid for how much I think that they should be, communicating with me? And you can almost separate out, like, what my expectations are versus what I think my partner's expectations are, or this person's expectations are, based on the attachment style and based on some of the information I just learned in the earlier part of this course. So for example, knowing that the DA tries to communicate on average in the dating phase every 3 to 5 days and meet once every week or once every 2 to 3 weeks at times. So getting really clear on that part and just managing your expectations. And then when you find yourself actually in the rumination portion where you're thinking about it, You can use something called a pattern interruption in neurolinguistic programming, and you can say cancel, cancel, and it'll just, sort of turn your conscious mind back online. And you can just ask yourself instead, okay, instead of focusing my attention to this person and my expectations of communication, I can go cancel, cancel, interrupt the pattern, and then ask myself, where do I want to focus my attention instead right now? And just take inventory, even in like the 7 areas of your life where you're feeling a little bit disempowered, and work to meet your own needs in those areas. Okay. Number 2, when it comes to overanalyzing, if you find yourself over analyzing and filling in the blanks, like, oh, I just left the date, and did I do this right? Did I do that right? Did I think this of me? Did I think that of me? You can just question this cognitive bias, because what you're doing when you're over analyzing and trying to fill in the blanks is essentially creating the cognitive distortion in CBT called mind reading. And you can set a thinking boundary around your mind reading. So let's say, for example, you catch yourself going on and in your mind and trying to figure out what the person thought of you or if you said the right thing. You can set a boundary and just say to yourself, okay, I recognize I'm mind reading right now. I can't really know what this person is thinking. All I can do is show up for myself and be true to myself as I enter into this process. And if the situation is really meant to work out for me, this person will lovingly accept me as myself and see me for who I am. And so you can just create this boundary and this awareness and change the way that you're perceiving and interacting with yourself in that overanalysis pattern. So instead of just letting it run on autopilot, you can pause, then you can set a boundary so that you have a healthy perception in your interactions with what the dating phase means to you. The next one, when it comes to perfectionism, okay? If I am trying to be perfect and get validation outside of myself for my perfectionism, chances are I do not meet my needs internally for self-validation. And so I'm trying to extra seek outside of myself to fill the void or the lack of validation inside of myself. And so if I catch myself falling into these behaviors, I want to start really working on self-validation and self-esteem in these areas. So I might do something like, every evening, sit down with a pen and paper and write 5 things that I did well or effectively today. And just actively take part in either recognizing your wins or self-validation. And what this will do is, because you are actually meeting some of your own needs here, it will help to equilibrate the void that you are trying to fill up only from the relationship outside of you. And it will take some pressure off of the relationship, as well as boost your self-esteem a little bit, which will only help you feel better when you go into the relationship or dating circumstances. Okay. When it comes to the too early syndrome, okay, so this idea that sometimes the anxious preoccupied develops, which is like, we should be moving at my pace. What I want you to remember as sort of a tip for this stage is this analogy around ice skating. Okay, I want you to imagine that you are on a date, and when you are on a date, your date itself is to go ice skating. And so you're at the skating rink and you're an expert skater, and your partner's never put on a pair of skates in their life. And there you are, and you get on the skating rink and you just are skating around, and then this person's left way behind. You can have fun skating and move at your own pace, but if you want to skate with this person is going to fall, and they're going to stumble, and they're going to have challenges and issues the entire way. And so your job is, if I want to be with this person, I have to learn to move at their pace. And as I learn to move at their pace, and as I skate with them, and I let them get some practice and some skills and some awareness here around skating, as they strengthen and get better, now we'll both be able to skate eventually and move at my pace collectively. Or, at a similar pace, and sort of co-create and have a good time skating together. And so the same thing goes for attachment styles that are more avoidant. If you're the anxious and you're with somebody who's more avoidant, you might have these expectations of like, we should be here by now, we should be doing this by now, we should have this much of commitment or connection, we should have moved in, we should be engaged. Like, all these sort of ideas can come up, and you have to remember that might be from somebody who has spent a lot of their life being really well practiced in emotional connection, what it means to connect emotionally to others, refining their skills, refining the way they connect. And so you might just be moving at a different pace from somebody with different needs, with a different set of awareness, a different set of tools. And as a result, that can actually make you disconnect. And so you want to be able to take inventory of how quickly you think this person needs to move based on their attachment style, based on the patterns you recognize within them, based on their dating history that they're maybe sharing with you. And then you want to find a nice midpoint so you can skate together, essentially. Okay, now when it comes to the chameleoning, okay, remind yourself, please, this is your tip for the chameleoning. Remind yourself that the right relationship for you is going to be the one that you are fully yourself in. It doesn't serve to be someone else, because you will lose the person, or you'll have a much more difficult time when the mask falls off in the power struggle stage. So use the practice of exposure response by consistently allowing yourself to be seen more and more in increments over time. So for example, let's say you think that, you're not allowed to want, to be introverted and not spend time doing social things, because maybe you're dating somebody who's really extroverted and they really value their social relationships. Over time, that part of you is going to come out, because you're going to need to honor yourself. And if you don't, you're going to be living inauthentically in your life, and it will cause pain. And so what you want to practice being able to do is allowing yourself to be seen. So maybe it's scary for you at first. And so your first time communicating, you just have to say something like, hey, you know what? I do value time alone sometimes. And maybe it frightens you to say that. And maybe the next time you say, yeah, I actually really value my time alone, and I can be introverted a lot of the time. Or, and you incrementally work up to expressing your truth if you find this is a point that you really struggle with. It doesn't matter how fast you do it. It matters that you actively start doing it immediately as soon as you recognize that there's a part of you that's dishonoring parts of yourself. Because again, these things will come out in different ways over time. And lastly, when it comes to pedestaling, okay, what you can do when you notice you have somebody else on a pedestal, and you're like, oh my gosh, and you're putting them way up on this pedestal, is you can look at, and this isn't, to be mean or rude, but you can look at all of these things that you are infatuated with, all these specific traits or behaviors in a person you're infatuating with. Try to look for the downsides of those traits. So for example, maybe the person that you're dating, you see them as being so charismatic and so able to connect with people. What's a downside? And look for the person specifically, but maybe you notice, hey, you know what? They're really charismatic, but sometimes they're so good at connecting to people, they don't value the depth of their relationships enough. Or they feel like they can connect with anybody anywhere, and so they don't work at their relationships enough. Whatever it is, just look for the downsides. And it's not so that you can start putting down your partner. It's so that you can actually open your selective perception. Because if you are hyper focusing on the positives and turning a blind eye to any potential negatives, you're not actually seeing this person in their wholeness. And usually you'll naturally start to become hyper focused, or really see these traits in the power struggle stage as your selective perception opens up. And then these things will hit you a little bit harder at that point. So just make sure you have a balanced perspective of this person, and you can use that as a strategy to do this work. So I will see you in the next module, and we are going to begin discussing the honeymoon phase of the anxious and preoccupied attachment styles relationship. Belief, so we can do that too. But ideas that I need to earn my worth in the world, I need to earn love. A lot of those concepts and ideas, maybe because those are things you felt like in childhood, or maybe in a past long-term relationship. You might have a parent, for example, that will withdraw affection if you, or closeness or emotional intimacy, if you are doing something bad. Okay, as a child, let's say, maybe you scream at your parent and you throw something and it breaks. You might see a withdrawal of affection. And that can seem on one level like it's a form of conditional love. And to a certain degree, the way the person is giving love is conditional, okay? Because they're not going to just love you fully when you do that. They might withdraw. But that doesn't mean that love from the parent is conditional, right? You might then go into your adult life and knock on wood, and not to say this is a good thing, but maybe then you kill somebody out of rage one day, you might still have the parent be like, I still love you as my child, right? So this is where we have this really interesting thing, and this is how the system of conditioning affects us so much, is because a lot of the emotional inferences we get because of what we see that version of conditional love, but it doesn't mean that we are conditionally loved. The next one are too early syndrome. So really what this talks about in the course is this idea often that in the dating phase, because the needs of the anxious preoccupied individual are so strong to get into a relationship, to have closeness, to meet each other's needs, to get needs met, sometimes an anxious preoccupied will jump into a relationship or try to pressure or push moving into a committed relationship and taking the relationship much more seriously before they've done their proper vetting. And it might seem like, oh, but that's what I need. But sometimes it's actually an abandonment of your true needs if you haven't taken the time to be clear about what those are, haven't taken the time to really do your vetting to see if this person can in fact meet those true needs, and get that feedback and understanding. And so it's a really important behavior to shift, especially in the dating phase of a relationship. And a huge part of how we overcome this, if you're an anxious preoccupied individual, or even if you're a fearful avoidant with a strong anxious side, is to practice strengthening self-identity. So to make sure that you have your balance in all 7 areas of life, to make sure that you are clear about who you are. Like, so much of the strengthening self-identity course is like getting clear about who you are in terms of your traits, your mission, your vision for your life, and actually being able to consciously intend, because a lot of that stuff, that programming, a lot of it just comes from pain and being imprinted, and they're not things that we would necessarily want as a part of ourselves if we had full choice and reign over everything. And so much of that course is also about, let me see what's not serving me and what I don't want to identify myself as, and let me work through reprogramming or getting rid of some of those painful programs I didn't ask for, and really shaping myself into who I want to become from my conscious perspective, where I get full say. And the stronger we are in there, the more we know who we are, the more we know or what we want, the more we know what to say no to. If we don't know who we are, we don't have that clarity and direction, then it's easy to just say yes to stuff or put up with things or push things along that we don't actually want at a deep level if we really took the time to investigate, because we haven't done that work. So strengthening your self-identity, getting a clear picture of who you are, who you want to become, all these different things is very powerful. And then chameleoning. 2 really quick things we can do is we can look at the long-term cost of this, always trying to contort ourselves into who we think people want us to be. We can actually look at the cost and evaluate how we're treating the relationship to ourselves and all of the inherent self-abandonment that takes place when you do that, because the brain's very much wired to avoid pain, so that will be a big motivator to shift. And then as a perceptual shift that you can practice is like, am I showing up for who I am? Am I living with my thoughts, my behaviors, my beliefs, my emotions in alignment with that vision of who I am that I've taken the time to investigate, get clear on, show up for, and have I done that work to align myself with that? And the more, again, we have that strengthening of self, the less likely we are to fall into those patterns. And then lastly, if we find we're putting somebody on a huge pedestal, we can revert back and we can go inwards and go, okay, what are the downsides of this person, or what are the traits I'm not owning within myself, so that I'm looking at the upsides of myself that I'm not perceptually focused on. So maybe you put somebody on a pedestal because you think that they are really smart. And maybe you're like, wow, they're so smart. You have them on this big pedestal. Well, then you're probably not recognizing your own genius. And everybody has their own genius in specific forms. For some people, it's scattered across 5 major places. For some people, it's really focused in on 1 or 2. And sometimes we can look and we can go, oh my gosh, look, that person's a genius at math. And maybe you're not recognizing what a genius you are with your social interactions, or with how you hold space for other people, or a genius in the way that you create or design, or, and so we want to make sure if we have somebody on a big pedestal, we're looking at what those traits and qualities are that we think are so amazing, and that we're actually owning those things within ourselves. So that's obviously our golden shadow work. You can do a deeper dive into that in the shadow work exercise, which is a highly, highly recommended course, but that should give you some big pieces. And then what I want you to do for the integration piece here is take 1 or 2 strategies that you want to focus on a week and just practice them on a daily basis. Pick one thing you can do daily and continue to do that until you feel like, okay, this has now become a normalized part of my behavior and who I am and who I understand myself to be. And this is now ingrained in my subconscious. It's a natural habit pattern in my life. And so that becomes that work.